Good morning, my captive audience. Let's take a look at the Harlem Renaissance today. This is APUSH Unit 7. Let's get started. All right, so before we get to the Harlem Renaissance, a brief history of African Americans in New York City. So we have to go all the way back to 1626, where the first African Americans were unloaded into New Amsterdam as slaves, and this was done in order to promote agriculture in the colony. This was not successful, and really New Amsterdam and later on New York are going to become places of commerce and not so much agriculture. The farms will probably be out in present day Queens, Long Island, but inside like Manhattan proper, Bronx, Staten Island, Brooklyn areas. That'll be mostly for commerce trading. So let's move ahead to 1776, when the American Revolution starts, and many African American slaves from New York fought in the American Revolution. However, they fought on the side of the British. Now remember, New York was primarily a loyalist stronghold during the Revolution, so it kind of makes sense here that the enslaved people would be fighting on the side of the British, and they fought on the side of the British because they were promised their freedom after the end of the war. Let's move ahead to 1827, when laws were passed to abolish slavery in New York City. And after this, communities of African Americans will pop up in Seneca Village, Staten Island, in Brooklyn. Weeksville was a big African American community in the 1800s. So that's where we are up to this point. But then let's look at Harlem now and how this Renaissance took place. So the Harlem Renaissance started in Harlem, New York City. It was started by a well-educated middle class of African Americans, and it's so significant because it is a lot of advancements, achievements in African American literature, art, music, theater. You name it. Remember that the term Renaissance means rebirth, like a golden age. Think about like your Greek Roman ages, Roman golden ages, the golden age of Islam. How do we identify those time periods? With achievements in the arts, in literature, etc. So this was an expression, Harlem Renaissance, in African American culture and identity. And these African American artists and writers and musicians are going to express themselves in ways that they had not been able to before. And this all started in Harlem. So, where is Harlem? It is in our city. If you have not been before, it's in the northern part of Manhattan, starting around 110th Street to maybe 155th Street. But there it is on the map in case if you were not familiar with where it was, or if you have not been there before. There it is. Don't go there now. We might have to stay home for a little while because of the coronavirus, but maybe when, maybe when things get better, take a trip up there. Anyway, not now though. Stay home. Don't get sick. All right, let's look at musicians. So as I mentioned in a previous video, I think, and as one of you mentioned in class previously, this time period was known as the Jazz Age in the 1920s because jazz music is going to become very popular and explode around the country, around the world. So important figures in spreading this jazz age would be Duke Ellington, who was a composer, a conductor, a musician. There he is on the right-hand side of the screen. Bessie Smith was also there she is, a famous singer of the jazz age. She was known as the Empress of the Blues, so like the Beyonce of the 1920s, I guess you could call it. And new dance steps known as the Charleston. If I can find a good enough video on the Charleston, I will post it on Google Classroom, but there's a few different variations. It's kind of hard for me to find a good one, but I'll look. Artists. Jacob Lawrence is going to be an important artist of the Harlem Renaissance, and he'll create a series of paintings known as Migration. I'll post a link to that on Google Classroom. It's worth a look. That all portray basically the experience, the African American experience of moving from the south to the north. Remember, this all occurred because of the Great Migration after World War I, and many African Americans moved north to look for factory work and try and kind of escape like the Jim Crow laws of the South. It's an attempt to find a better life, get more money, get a better job. So Lawrence's Migration series is going to try and chronicle that whole movement north, and that picture on the bottom is one of the paintings in his series. Augusta Savage was another artist. Oh, there's another Jacob Lawrence. See the train to New York, Chicago, St. Louis. Let's get to Augusta Savage, sculptor, and there's one of her works right there, again showing like choirs, important figures. The church, the Baptist church, was a big part of life for many African Americans in the South. That's going to be brought up to the North during the Harlem Renaissance. So she's going to make some important pieces like that kind of very beautiful looking harp. Writers. Writers of the Harlem Renaissance are going to call for action against bigotry and criticize through their work the racial segregation, the Jim Crow laws. Langston Hughes wrote a very famous poem, What Happens to a Dream Deferred? There it is in a little word cloud on the bottom. W.E.B. Du Bois, we're hearing about him again, right? Co-founder of the NAACP. What else do you remember about W.E.B. Du Bois? What did he think should be done for African Americans in the United States regarding equality? And Zora Neale Hurston, who was writer, folklorist, anthropologist, and all of these, again, African-American writers are going to write about their experiences and also try to just raise awareness about the situations that African-Americans in the United States face, and they'll have the freedom to do that in Harlem. So what was the impact of the Harlem Renaissance? Well, again, when we cover these topics, start thinking, so what? Why is this important? Well, I'll tell you why it's so important. There is evidence during the Harlem Renaissance that some African Americans found improvement in their standard of living. You can look at that. You can see that in the Harlem neighborhood in the 1920s. And the fact that these Americans were comfortable enough to start writing music, writing literature and poetry and painting and dancing, and opening theaters. You don't do things like that if you're in poverty. So it shows that some African Americans, not all African Americans, okay, because we do have, again, the ones that are living in, the poorest housing in Detroit, Chicago, the ones that are still stuck in the South facing segregation, and the Southern Democrats. So you have those that are still in poverty. It's not better for every single African American in the 1920s, and please keep that in mind as we continue to cover this. But some were able to found an improvement in the standard of a living. You don't get a golden age and a renaissance without being somewhat financially comfortable. The neighborhood of Harlem became very famous for its actors, artists, musicians, writers, and everyone went to Harlem to see these works of art, hear these musicians, go to these jazz clubs like the Cotton Club to see all of these performers. So artists start performing before integrated audiences, because white people would go to Harlem and integrate with Black performers, Black audience members in some cases, and you'd have these integrated audiences, and you would have whites and non-whites interacting with each other while most of the nation practiced racial segregation. So that's kind of significant too. However, though, was everything 100% equal? Well, no. If you look at the, if I give you the example of like the Cotton Club from the first slide, let me go back to it. That's the Cotton Club. This was a jazz club, had dancers, performers, singers, you name it. And it was all African American performers. However, the only people allowed in the audience were whites, and it was owned by gangsters. Actually, it was owned by the mafia in New York. I forget the specific family that owned the Cotton Club, but were all clubs in Harlem like this? No, there were black and white audiences integrated, but not at the Cotton Club. Black performers, only white audience. So that's the Harlem Renaissance. I felt that it needed its own video because why the heck not? What else am I going to do? I hope you all have a good weekend. Please, if you haven't answered that little how are you question, please do so by Monday, 9 o'clock p.m. Or else, if I don't hear from you, I gotta tell Mr. Cameron in administration, and he'll reach out to you. So please just drop me a line, let me know that you're okay, and I will be happy. Anyway, have a good weekend. Enjoy. Try to get some rest. Try not to work too hard, and I will see you all next week. Take care.